Hey, welcome back from lunch, everyone. I'm Miles. I'm moderating this session. So we're going to diverge from the program a little bit, and we're going to have Temur Umarov from Carnegie Endowment of International Peace speak first, because he's in Central Asia and the time difference is very difficult. So without further ado, we'll turn over to him to speak on his Uzbekistani political regime stability after the Karakalpakstan crisis. Do you want to go ahead?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you great. We cannot see you. Hang on.
Yeah, that's not my presentation. Unfortunately, I don't have one.
We'll fix that.
So yeah. Okay, let me start. I wanted to start by pointing out that although I'm from Uzbekistan, but I'm not from Karakalpakstan, and I might not fully understand how everything is perceived from Karakalpakstan itself, but I'm from Samarkand, the city in Uzbekistan that is also dominated by the ethnic minority, and I know how it feels to not have a representation of your language in the city, and to not to represent the ethnic majority of the country. I think the events in Karakalpakstan shook Central Asia and many people who follow Central Asia, because for a long period of time, Uzbekistan has been seen as this island of stability in the region. If we compare Uzbekistan to other political regimes in Central Asia, the best examples would be Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And if we take a look at the statistics of the amount of protests that happen in Uzbekistan, these, according to the Oxford Society's great protest tracker, we would see that there is a huge difference between countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. In Uzbekistan, the control over the society was always much tougher and stronger, and especially after 2005 Andijan protests and the massacre that happened after that, the society does not really choose to go to the streets to reach out to the government and to reach any kind of goal. So this was the image of Uzbekistan for a long period. But since the summer protests in Karakalpakstan, it has changed. And we right now at the moment where we want to find out what really happened, what were the reasons, and what are the outcomes of that. For the reasons, there might be several explanations. There were many thoughts that this is a sign of kind of separatism growing in Karakalpakstan. However, I should say that if we take a look at Karakalpakstan society, or try to get a sense of what are the separate groups exist inside Karakalpakstan, we will see that there are almost non-existent inside the region. Because from the very beginning of the independence period, Islam Karimov actually repressed a lot of activists, and this is something that was pointed out a lot of times by the human rights organizations across the world. And till today, there is no real group of people who have influence inside Karakalpakstan and don't have resources for really creating any narratives about separatist movement. The main reason for the protests, in my view, was the mistake from the Uzbek central government that didn't really understand the situation on the ground, didn't really have the data about the society and their views of the world, of the system, of how the government should work. And because of that, the first edition of the constitutional amendment that were presented to the people of Uzbekistan right before the events in Karakalpakstan, they included a point that that actually erased autonomy of Karakalpakstan Republic inside of Uzbekistan. And this was the moment when everything got started. The people went to the streets, and the government was very quick in repressing people, a lot of arrests. The internet was shut down for almost a month, and there was no way to really find out what's happening inside of the biggest city of Karakalpakstan, the capital in Nukus. And right now we only see the consequences of these events. But what the government really underestimated, the feeling in Karakalpakstan of unfairness, because if we just take a look at the official statistic of Uzbekistan, we will see that although Karakalpakstan presents a lot to the economic development of Uzbekistan, it has huge territory which is rich with oil and gas resources. It produces different chemical products, and is a very important region from the point of view of economic development of Uzbekistan. However, on the other side, if we take a look at the situation with just basic necessities and the basic needs of the people, they are not fully covered. Compared to all other regions of Uzbekistan, Karakalpakstan is a very depressive region. People don't even have the access to clean water in many places. According to the official statistics, only 57% of the people who live in Karakalpakstan do have that. So it created some kind of feeling among the people who live there of this unfairness, that they contribute a lot to the economy, but don't have the return. And the constitutional amendment was just another point in this unfairness. So it was just underestimated by the central government. Now we see that the government found itself in a very uncomfortable situation. The constitutional amendments were put on pause for a very long period of time, and right now they are again were presented to the people. It has a point about the autonomous status of Karakalpakstan Republic. The government didn't make its mistake twice. But all other points, and actually the main goal of the constitutional amendments are still there. the presidential term is longer than it was before. Now it's going to be 7 years, and the power of president has also been expanded, but the effect of the protests of Karakalpakstan for the central government are the following. First of all, right now, central government is much more careful in new political innovations, implementations of different new ideas. The second change is the creation of new tools of control over the government. Here, Uzbekistan learns a lot from other authoritarian regimes, like from Russia. There are a couple of laws that have been implemented, and actually the constitution, the new edition of it, also has some points that look like that they were inspired by Russians' new constitution. There are also new attempts to create a technological tools in controlling the narratives in social media. There are different facts of the creation of these troll factories that would allow help the government promote its new ideas. There are also attempts to not to have a kind of not to stop the reforms that have been going on in Uzbekistan for the last 6 years, but also the change in the way reforms are happening. For example, if we talk about the change in the political structure, we still see that all institutions of the government, all branches of power are concentrated in the hands of the president himself and the administration of president. And the administration, in the end of the day, is the only body inside of the government that takes that makes all of the important decisions. And if anyone wants to really understand who are the most powerful people in Uzbekistan's political system, we should take a look at those people who have easy access to the administration of the president, or take a look at the people who actually work in the administration. And we actually saw that after the Karakalpakstan protest, the people who are affiliated with the administration of president, who work there, changed. Right now, we see that the majority of people who work there are relatives, not the majority, but still the number of relatives in the administration of president himself grew. Right now, his daughter also works at the administration of president, and there are also some people who have been close to Shavkat Mirziyoyev from the very beginning of his presidency. At the end of the day, the political regime became much more careful in the future steps in political reforms, but also the president himself tries to have people around him who have who kind of share the full loyalty and in whose personalities he doesn't have any kind of concerns. I will stop here and will be happy to answer any questions you have.
Because he has to leave, I'm going to allow for 3 questions, if there's any questions right now on Uzbekistan. And then I want to alert, the laptop's about to die. So we're at 6-7%. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Timur. Thank you. This is Gavin Hull from USIP. I think this is something that's going to apply to some of the other cases we look at, but how do you explain the government's mistake in constitutional reform? How it badly misread what the consequences of these changes would be? And I would argue that, maybe we see the same thing in Kazakhstan in the January events and the same thing in Karakalpakstan, but I'm curious about why you think this unforced error happened.
Hey, go ahead.
Should I answer or
Yeah.
we'll collect the question?
Hang on, we're gonna get a couple more questions, so hang on.
Okay.
Hi, Timur. My name is Ulukbek Gulamov. I'm working with the government on legal reforms, and I just wanted to kind of follow up on that question, the last question, with regards to the points missed or the opportunities missed, and 2 angles to the question. First, the narrative that the government had about speculative unseen forces that have influenced the events, and the points that the similarities that they draw with Kazakhstan and Gorno-Badakhshan on the one hand, and kind of the simple lack of competence in spotting the potential threat that something as basic as that constitutional reform could have had. And do you see that they're correcting the course now because the reforms are still continuing? Thank you.
Okay, and one last question.
Hi, Alex Sanchez, I'm a defense analyst. This is a question not about something that you talked about, Timur, but kind of related. Also, you can talk a little bit about the case against Gulnara Karimova and what it tells you about what the current president is doing to erase the legacy of the Karimov regime and really create his own image. Thank you.
Where you can go.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to start with the first question about how the government even did this mistake. I think the answer to this question lies in the essence of the political regime of Uzbekistan, which is not democratic. And of course, in this kind of political system, the government itself destroyed the flow of ideas between the people in power and the society, and because of those channels, they don't work. Government kind of lives in its own bubble, and this is not the unique situation for Uzbekistan. And previously, during Karimov's times, the technique that the government used to have control over the society is to eliminate any small attempts of people to create any groups, even though these groups would be out of politics, but still anything that would bring people together was banned, and any kind of cooperation in the society would have to be happen with the help of the government. So the government would monitor what's going on there, and would be the main body that organizes any kind of events or meetings, anything. With the and I think here we can compare actually Uzbekistan to other Central Asian countries. I think what did change from the Karimov's times is that, first of all, technological leap of the whole region. Right now, much more people have access to internet, easy access to internet than ever before. Everyone has phones, social media, etc. And people who are much younger became politically active. Just easy demographics, 50% of Central Asia is younger than 30 years. And combining those two things, demography and technology, creates a very easy organization tool for the people. And right now you don't need to have opposition leader, you don't need to have a group of people who are organized and know each other and meet. You just need social media and one problem that would bring people together and create protest. That is why we see that those protests are happening all across Central Asia. And it's very difficult for the government to control this, because, this is something that is very difficult to track. And that is why we see different attempts of, for example, Kazakhstan creating some attempts of implementing like smart cities and controlling people using cameras, etc., big data. We see Uzbekistan using troll factories so that they can control the narrative in the internet. But these are very small steps in this attempt to control the new trends. So it's very difficult. On the question number 2 about, it was almost the same, but also why do governments use those kind of blame the some secret groups of people, terrorists, etc., for every problem that they have. I think answer here is very obvious, because it's very convenient for the government to say that it's not us, it's not our people, it's just some outsiders who are influencing young people who don't have their kind of system of ideas being stable, and they have vacuum in their heads, etc. But sometimes it's also very easy to blame anything for terrorism, so that terrorism looks like an ideal enemy for everyone. And when you fight terrorism, you can easily find sympathy in not only your own society, but also outside of the country. And it will be easier later to be on the good side of history when you would be facing a lot of questions about casualties, etc. The correction of the course, I think in some countries it is happening. For example, in Kazakhstan, I know that the government is trying to build its own inside government small think tank that would be collecting views of the people, collecting sociological data about the situation in the government, etc. But in Uzbekistan, all of the think tanks that I know that work for the administration of president or the government, I don't see real expertise or analysis coming out of these particular institutions. And I've talked to the people who work there, and in many situations, they say that sometimes they don't have even freedom to write everything they want. They don't have the freedom to criticize the government or different policies that being represented. So the whole idea of this kind of small think tank under the administration of the president is just lost.
Okay.
And third question. Yes,
yeah.
sorry.
No, it's fine. Uncle Laura, I think we're gonna have to skip it because of time. I'm sorry about that. We've got to get through the rest. So thank you for answering those questions. We'll have to get to Laura another time. And then
Thank you.
So I want to thank Timur from joining us from Kyrgyzstan, and then now we're going to turn it over to Sean Roberts for Kazakhstan, looking back at the January riots and their causes.
All right, thank you very much. So this I changed kind of the topic of my talk a little bit. It's more focused on the question of whether the January 2022 events change Kazakhstan's rules of the game. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is I was recently in Kazakhstan, and when I talked to people both in government and civil society, they frequently went back to this phrase, rules of the game. And they were talking about that they were changed, or at least changing. So, how do I move this?
The arrow, the forward arrow, lower left.
I got it. Okay. So first of all, what happened in January 2022 in Kazakhstan? So I should first have a caveat that a lot still remains unclear. But it appears at the very least that two things happened. First, there was a widespread but decentralized protest movement that began over escalating gas prices in Western Kazakhstan, but then it spread throughout the country. And fairly quickly, the protesters' demands expanded to talk about the political and economic system of the country as a whole. But second, there was an apparent intra-elite power struggle that seems to have played out in the form of street violence around the protests in Almaty. And the thing that was really striking to me when I was in Kazakhstan is I spoke to a lot of people who I would expect to be authoritative analysts on current events in Kazakhstan, and nobody had the same story about what happened in terms of an intra-elite power struggle. And part of the reason for that is the government has not been very forthcoming on what happened. And just like in Karakalpakstan, but I think even more so, the government is continually explained what happened as being an attack by extremists from abroad. And even in terms of that, there hasn't been much detail about what actually, who these extremists were, what was their reason for attacking Kazakhstan. And I think very few people believe that narrative. And I think that's one problem in the country right now, is that people want the government to explain exactly what happened. But it is interesting to see that the government mysteriously arrested the head of the security forces, who was a close associate of former President Nazarbayev, and took actions against other close associates of the former president, including arresting his nephew, Kairat Saltabaldi. So it does seem to be that there is something of a struggle between people who were associated with the former president and the current administration. But so we're asking the question about whether this event changes the rules of the game in Kazakhstan. We have to talk about very briefly what were the rules of the game in Kazakhstan prior to 2022. And I think this is pretty, I'll just briefly talk about this because most of you have read various accounts of this, I'm sure yourself. But President Nazarbayev had established rule in the country, initially with a mandate of 2 4-year terms, but he and his supporters were able to manipulate constitutional changes and snap elections so that that was extended to a 28-year term. He surrounded himself with a very small circle of elites, primarily who were younger elites in the Soviet period, apparatchiks, directors of state-owned enterprises, people from the oil and gas industry, and people involved in Soviet trade. And these people benefited significantly from privatization and became very wealthy, in turn working to ensure that Nazarbayev remained in power. So it was a symbiotic relationship where Nazarbayev ensured this group's continued wealth and this group ensured Nazarbayev's continued power. What Henry Hale has termed a system of patronal power. However, it would be unfair to characterize Nazarbayev's rule purely about that. This system certainly ensured that Kazakhstan has never become a functioning democracy, but it also fueled its development despite the substantial elite capture of state wealth. Kazakhstan under Nazarbayev was kind of a classic example of a developmental state. Power was concentrated in the hands of an autocrat, but that autocrat was able to make some very good policy decisions, was able to establish a quite professional technocracy of very competent civil and foreign servants. And this benefited the country's economic growth. And in turn, most of the population saw no reason to not support the status quo and not to support President Nazarbayev. However, I would say this was already reaching a plateau before 2022. Economic growth from privatization and natural resource extraction and export was starting to slow down naturally, and that was also accompanied with the fact that elite capture of wealth and its movement offshore was not infusing more capital into the local economy. And I think already, I guess ever since probably 2006, in the beginning of kind of the global financial crisis, citizens in Kazakhstan have been feeling that things are not getting better for them. So I think that's one of the causes of the protests in January 2022. It was an increasing failure of the existing rules of the game to meet the demands and expectations of citizens. And of course, I think also, the social pressures of COVID-19 likely also contributed to this. I mean, we saw protests in the US around Black Lives Matter. We've also seen in Karakalpakstan, we've seen it around the world. And I think people took a pause and were able to digest a mistake by the government, let's say, in terms of increasing gas prices, and reflect on that and start thinking about what needs to be done to change the situation. So the question is, in some ways, the protesters were demanding that the rules of the game change, but have they changed, or are they changing now? So I would say the rules of the game in Kazakhstan are in flux. As I mentioned, speaking to government officials, civil society actors, everybody was talking to me recently when I was there about how the rules of the game were changing. And the government has not really recognized that the protests in January 2022 were legitimate. They've displace that idea with the accusations of blaming it on terrorists. But at the same time, officials with whom I spoke, they would acknowledge that, yes, things have to change. We realize we have to start listening to people's grievances because obviously there are some issues in our country that we have to deal with. And in terms of this inter-elite struggle, the government again has not disclosed what kind of inter-elite struggle, who was involved. They kind of picked scapegoats such as Karim Masimov, who was the head of the KMB. But who else was really involved in this? It's not clear. But we do see, as I already mentioned, that the government's taking certain actions against economic elite that was close to Nazarbayev, and especially within his family. At the same time, that's not really across the board. I mean, a lot of the civil society actors I talked to in the country said, we don't believe things will change until we see the people change. And a lot of the people in government are the same people who were there under Nazarbayev. A lot of the people who are the major economic sources of power in the country are the same people. And I think that creates a lot of tension in terms of actually changing the rules of the game. So if the rules of the game are in flux, the question remains, will they change? Civil society and political activists I talked to were convinced that they will inevitably change. And part of that confidence was about their own empowerment, that they felt we went on the streets, we were able to speak our minds, get the attention of the government, and if need be, we'll do that again. But people were less sure whether the present government was going to make substantive change happen. And I understand that because I think there's mixed messages coming out of the present administration under Tokayev. On the one hand, he's talking about a new Kazakhstan, which sounds very much like new Uzbekistan. But he's also talking about the end of the oligarch economy, which, as I described earlier, was kind of the backbone of Kazakhstan's rules of the game. And he's also talking about increased democracy. But so far, we haven't seen serious movements towards any of this. The recent presidential election was deeply flawed. A lot of people, when I was in country in December, so they were anticipating and hoping for real positive changes in the parliamentary election. Now, what is it, like a week later, it doesn't seem there has been real changes. And I should point out the civil society is fairly patient about what its expectations for change are. They were saying, well, the political parties are the same old pro-government political parties, but even if one or two of these independent candidates came and won a seat in parliament, that would improve the situation. And it's not clear whether that has happened with this election. One thing I don't know is whether we see some change at the local level in terms of representation in the maslihats. And I would say at the local level, I visited Aktau and Shymkent. In both of those places, you did sense that things were changing. The Akamats were much more open and actually trying to engage citizens on issues. And we should remember that the violence around these protests didn't happen outside Almaty. It was really in Almaty. And so the experience in the regions was much different. People felt like the government felt they were under pressure from citizens to be accountable for their actions. And on the local level, I talked to a lot of activists who wanted to run for Maslihat. They wanted to run in these new pilot village Akimat elections and so on. So there is a sense that there could be some movement there. But I would say that this is a critical time. There's rapid inflation. The disruption of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is really, and I know I wasn't here this morning, but I'm sure you've already talked all about how that's impacted Central Asia. It's a time where the government has an opportunity to change the rules of the game in Kazakhstan. And I think that there's certainly a constituency within the government that wants to make those changes, but because that system is so wrapped up with the economic power in the country, I think there's a lot of reticence to dismantle what already exists. So I'll just end by saying this is a real opportunity. I expect the next couple years to be economically difficult for Kazakhstan. The situation of average citizens is probably not going to improve. There's inflation. The sanctions on Russia create all kinds of problems for Kazakhstan. And I think that it's a real opportunity for Tokayev's administration to show people that they have a vision for change and one that's more focused on the needs of the general population and less beholden to a small circle of elites. And I think people, I'm even talking about real activists, the most ardent activists in the country, are ready to be patient for that change. But they also indicated the moment they see that that change is not going even incrementally forward, that they are ready to go back on the streets. So I think it's an opportunity to bring a new level of stability to Kazakhstan following 3 decades where the economy has rapidly expanded, but also has slowed and leveled off. So I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you. Next, we have Asel Doolotkeldieva on populism and risk for governance in Kyrgyzstan. We'll make sure she's active here. Can you hear us?
I see you and I hear you.
Can't hear. I hear you. Hang on a second.
Okay, I take off the phone. So my name is Asel. Thanks for.
Also, can you come a little bit closer to your microphone? Really can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Great. My name is Asel. Small correction. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. Thanks for having me. I've been enjoying all these panels today. They're very comprehensive and very timely. So I was asked to reflect on risks and challenges for governments in Kyrgyzstan, and I decided to do so through the prism of populism, because this is what type of politics we currently have in Kyrgyzstan. So since 2.5 years after the third popular uprising in Kyrgyzstan, we have a new regime, we have a new elite of Sadir Japarov, which is made up of roughly three networks of President Sadir Japarov himself and his home opposition supporters. Then there is the head of security, Temur, and third is the head of the cabinet of ministers, Akılbek Japarov. So the three have divided the three blocks among themselves. The first is the foreign, in the first place is the foreign policy and what I call the domestic coherence. In the second place, it's a security bloc, and the third is the economic governance. And as I was writing previously in my papers, this triumvirate works rather well. Of course, there are frictions among themselves, but this division of labor is pretty effective to date. To think maybe Kasheev the head of security have more power among the three due to his control over the security apparatus. But he is not a charismatic leader. He cannot talk to the domestic nor the external audiences. That's why he actually needs Sadyr Japarov, who is much more charismatic leader. In a country like Kyrgyzstan, I think the profile of Tashev could not really work for a long time. And as for the head of the cabinet of ministers, like Sadyr Japarov, he's more of a disposable person, but they keep him because he has energy for all sorts of reforms. Now, the workability of this composite elite network does not necessarily mean that there are no consequences for the state institutions and their governance and the governmental policies. Actually, what we face today, what we observe today in Kyrgyzstan is the paralysis of state institutions and the sabotage of governmental reforms. And this is due mainly to the structural reasons. Their salaries of civil servants are extremely low, as well as their training. But more increasingly, there is also a security surveillance after the governmental officials. Today, the governmental officials and, for example, the head of department in important ministries, they are afraid of persecution, and that's why they don't really go ahead with the reforms. Therefore, we don't see any concrete outcomes of those announced government plans, such as attracting foreign investment to Kyrgyzstan, such as making Kyrgyzstan the hub of green energy based on small hydropower stations and so on and so forth. On the contrary, there are pressures on businesses. There are regular scandals involving known businesses being expropriated by the security services. So basically, this anti-corruption campaign, which was so instrumental for Sadyr Japarov and Tashev 2.5 years ago during their parliamentary election, and this, which is still central today. It's very questionable whether this is indeed an anti-corruption campaign or it is more of an extortion model business actually in place. So, okay, besides now this very quick outline of how the Sadyr Japarov scheme works, and what are the consequences of such networked governance for the state institutions. This 2.5 years of Sadyr Japarov's rise to power were quite eventful in terms of external shocks for the country and tragic events. Not to mention now this quite a massive inflow of Russian political migrants to Kyrgyzstan, which really shook up the estate market, brought a lot of inflation and so on and so forth. There was the most tragic event, the most important event was the military incursion of the Tajik army in the border areas in September 2022. And that caused at least 200 deaths on both sides, 130,000 displaced people inside Kyrgyzstan. We don't know the figures for Tajikistan, and massive destruction of homes, businesses, social infrastructure. And there's a very slow reconstruction today. People are not really returning to homes. They're afraid that these border zones are turned into an unviable zones of no peace, and the guarantees given by the Kyrgyz government are not sufficient for people to return. So this remains really a high security issue for Kyrgyz authorities. But what followed this event was now the authoritarian management of another border delimitation with Uzbekistan, the so-called Kempirabad case. There was a massive arrest of opposition politicians, of civil society, of journalists and activists. More than 30 people are now still detained under dubious charges, and the public don't know neither the details of the deal with the Uzbek government over the passage of the water reservoir to the Uzbek side, neither the status of the peace talks with the Tajik government. The latter is naturally very crucial because the publics are concerned whether we now move into a sort of a frozen conflict with Tajikistan. So this does not really excuse the military the use of heavy military weapons, but what preceded this was a populist approach to the border management. Japarov and Tasheev made very swift promises to the Kyrgyz public that they will resolve the border issues very quickly with Tajikistan. Then there was this display of the new Tiger personal carriers, then the purchase of the Turkish drones, which were advertised by Tasheev himself. So quite populist approaches to a very difficult situation, which has been also a very old conflict. So what is striking against the background of these tragic events, these shocking developments, is that there's still, President Japarov still enjoys a rather relatively high support within the Kyrgyz society. According to the latest polls conducted by IRI in September 2022, I think it was before the events on the borders, Japarov was the first trusted politician in Kyrgyzstan with 38%. The second in place was Tasheev with 18%, and the third was another religious leader. So we have to be, of course, careful because this survey polls do not always accurately reflect the moods within society, but we still have to give the credit that he still enjoys popularity. And his populist style is one answer to that striking aspect. He continues to be very active on social media, personally answers to messages and posts on Facebook and so on. And he favors personal meetings with ordinary people, in which he, for example, makes very swift solutions and decisions, criticizes harshly the slow bureaucracy and the rapacious elites, and this way basically spreads the myth about himself as being a good or nice guy, and the entourage is sabotaging his work. And his team has been still propelling basically Kumtor, the successful, so-called successful nationalization of Kumtor, then the increase of wages, salaries for teachers and other critical social servants, civil servants, I'm sorry, their successful delimitation with the Uzbek government, and this kind of cases, which conceal the other side of the coin, of course. For example, with the Kumtor, we know that now the environmental cost of the rehabilitation of the gold mine, reclamation and the destruction of the glaciers will now fall on the Kyrgyz government, and we don't know the full scope of that damage. For another thing is that, for example, after the border conflicts in Batken, there was a promise by the government to increase the salaries and the social packages of the militaries and of the border guards, which was then reversed without the public knowing it, right? And other such negative sides, we simply don't know them. So, so far, populist approaches, populist authoritarian policies have been working to sustain Japarov's support base. But at the same time, of course, it's not without the critical voices. There's a strong civil society, and although fragmented and dispersed opposition, but they voice criticism. Plus the growing usage of authoritarian repression by the government and the usage of these troll factories to basically promote and control the narrative in society is also indicative that populist policies probably are not that effective in the long term. So it needs to be observed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was a presentation. Turkmenistan increasingly fragile despite its economic assets.
Thank you. So, yes, we're moving now to Turkmenistan. So we all heard, sorry, I just trying to find. So we all heard after independence about the image of Turkmenistan, as a kind of Kuwait of Central Asia, thanks to its hydrocarbon riches and thanks to its small population, just a few millions. But I mean, the country, as you know, has been facing a long-standing crisis, especially after the fall of the world hydrocarbon prices in 2014. And this difficult situation, this difficult economic situation of Turkmenistan results from multiple factors, including poor utilization of the country riches, no real economic diversification, the neo-patriarchal nature of the regime, and the corruption and embezzlement. And all of that has severely reduced the state budget and investment to develop human capital, which is essential to transform the economic riches of a country to strategies for development. And as actually the economics Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker wrote 30 years ago in his book on human capital, human capital is particularly vital in industrial and post-industrial economies where technical skills are demanded to both maintain the economic enterprise and further its development. And so this is this lack of human capital I would like to focus today, in Turkmenistan. So I use, by human capital, I use this definition, that is a stock of knowledge, skills, experience, health, personal attributes, and values that influence the productive power of an individual. Like other forms of capital, human capital can be grown through investment, it can appreciate and depreciate in value, and it generates returns to the investor. And human capital includes many components, such as education, experience, judgment, skills, and many of them, of course, are interdependent. I don't have time to elaborate on all of them. So I'm going to focus on education. So, education has a very difficult legacy in Turkmenistan. I won't elaborate on that, but Niyazov undertook the first president Niyazov undertook major reforms that very significantly undermined the school and university system, including, but not only, but including by reducing school mandatory curriculum from 11 to 9 years, and by reducing the number of years of higher education to 2 years in 2003. But where are we now when it comes to education in Turkmenistan? So, Vladimir Hamidov took a few positive measures by extending again the school curriculum to 12 years and by restoring the higher education system. But yeah, when you see about investment in education in Turkmenistan remains very low. The 2019 public expenditure on education in the country was just 3.1% of GDP, while in countries with high to very high development, the spending is usually between 4.5 to 5.3% of GDP. And all Central Asian countries, as you can see here, spend more money on education. And you see Kazakhstan 4.4, Kyrgyzstan 6.2, Tajikistan 5.9, and Uzbekistan 5.1. So when it comes to education, Turkmenistan faces many issues. issues, which are not necessarily, by the way, specific to Turkmenistan. I mean, all the Central Asian countries face many of them. The biggest concern for Turkmenistan is this combination of low investment with extreme, I would say, extreme authoritarianism, which even worsens the situation. So among the many issues that education is facing in the country, you have the lack of educated teachers, which, according to UNICEF, is probably now the largest threat to Turkmenistan education system, which results from poor training, but also from poor working conditions for teachers, and which drive many people away from the profession. Another point, getting admitted to higher education institution is very difficult. I mean, enrollment rate in tertiary education in Turkmenistan is very low. It's 16% only, compared to an average rate for Europe and Central Asian region of 76%. It's the lowest rate in Central Asia. I mean, it's low in Uzbekistan, which is at 21%, 31% in Tajikistan, 53% in Kyrgyzstan, and 71% in Kazakhstan. And not only do students need very high scores on entrance exams to university, but bribery on acceptance decisions is actually complex. This means that even for some good students to access higher tertiary education is not a given if their parents or they cannot pay the bribes. And I want to add that getting tertiary education is increasingly gender discriminated. Women account only for only 32% of students in university now. The government also has stated that repeatedly its goal to develop distance learning, but the teaching staff in Turkmenistan are not trained to organize or write online learnings and are unlikely to become seriously involved in this type of teaching in the current context of difficult working conditions. And so education is also limited. So I would say it's very limited by authoritarianism and censorship. So another major, for example, another major obstacle to the development of online education and to education overall is a very weak development of internet in Turkmenistan. The internet penetration rate stood at only 30.8% of the total population last year in 2022. And the Turkmen government actually has repeatedly stated that to develop and improve the internet, for example, by equipping higher education institutions with 4 megabytes per second for internet bandwidth, and secondary vocational schools with 2 megabytes per second by 2025. Just to show you, so here, what a 2 to 4 megabytes per second mean if we bring that in a regional or global perspective. So I made a table with, as you can see, the 5 top countries which have the fastest internet, which, by the way, as you can see, include some really non-democratic, really authoritarian countries like China and the United Emirates. And so with Turkmenistan, which is again way lower than all other Central Asian countries, with 3 of them, so between 40 and 48, and Tajikistan, which is lower with 22. But here Turkmenistan comes, so it's only 2.36, and it is ranked 178 out of 200 out of 180 countries. So the only countries which have which have lower internet is Afghanistan and Cuba. And if internet is slow, it's of course not because of a lack of technology in Turkmenistan. Internet is kept low on purpose. So you have so many websites blocked, including those who can be used for educational purposes, such as online encyclopedias, development platform for IT professionals, and access to online libraries. So overall, the lack of unemployment is very likely to worsen several endemic issues that Turkmenistan is facing, such as unemployment. I mean, the official rate provided by the government is 4.8, which that all economists say is totally disconnected from the reality. The UN actually brought some figures as high as 60%, especially among the young population. And the lack of employment opportunities and future prospects for Turkmenistan has led to a major wave of immigration out of Turkmenistan. It is estimated now that 1.9 million Turkmen left the country since 2008. And so there are also some estimates that less than 3 million Turkmenistani citizens still live in the country out of a population which was estimated between 5 and 6.5 million. Well, migration is of course not necessarily bad. I mean, you have 95,000 students, Turkmen students who study abroad now, which is a way to compensate for a bad education system. But first, this option is accessible only to a minority of the population who is able to finance such studies. And Turkmenistan is also experiencing now a phenomenon of brain drain. I'm using a paper published by website Progress Online, sorry, and showing that while all graduates of Turkmen universities were employed in Turkmenistan, only 40% of those who were educated abroad are now employed in Turkmenistan. So I'm concluding by saying that I mean, again, I won't say that Turkmenistan is unique, but Turkmenistan, what is worrying is that Turkmenistan stands out from many other authoritarian countries that invest in human capital. I mean, conventional wisdom holds that autocracies are much less likely to invest in human capital than their democratic counterparts. Which is not true. Several studies have shown that a substantial number of authoritarian regimes have invested more in education actually than have ordinary democracies, and also suggest that democracies do not necessarily provide better education than do autocracies. So, and why? Because in many authoritarian regimes, by investing in human capital, autocrats can boost citizens' perceived levels of social mobility and neutralize threats from the masses, from people, and then sustain political stability in their authoritarian regime. So, I mean, my point, of course, here is not to praise the authoritarian regimes, but just to raise the concern that extreme authoritarianism combined with a low education raise really red flags for the future development of Turkmenistan. Stop here. Thank you.
I want to thank all our speakers. We have about a little over 5 minutes for a round of questions. So we'll take questions and then we do have one online, but you want to go ahead and give me questions? Hang on 1 second, you need the microphone. Mr. Umarov had to go to bed. Like he said you can DM him at Umarov on Twitter, and he'll answer any questions that you have.
Hi, my name is Aydar Raif. I'm independent political analyst for Central Asia. My question is to Melanie and Asel. Just hearing Melanie, if the global economic recession is going to come through and it's going to have that effect in Tajikistan, do you think it's going to be reasons for Rahman government to escalate the border situation to, how do you call it, classic win over heart of the domestic population, have an external enemy entering Kyrgyz borders? So it's more of like episode 3 of the conflict.
Okay, other questions? I have one for Sean. It is from, do you think Karim must is he a scapegoat because he's over? Because we're gonna, does that matter? That's the question for you. Any other questions before we have those? Go ahead.
Noah Berea, I'm with the small education nonprofit Buffalo Creek International. For Sebastian, have any countries been able to influence the educational scene in Turkmenistan more than others? China, Russia, Turkey, or any others?
All right, so we'll start. Does anyone want to go first? Asel, do you want to go first? Did you hear the question?
I think the question was directed to Melanie, not me.
He asked about the border situation with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, whether Tajikistan would use it as to create an external enemy, but I think you could argue, you could ask the same thing about Kyrgyzstan, so anything that you see.
Well,
I'm not sure she heard.
yeah. It's a hard link to make, I think, between global recession and border conflict with Kyrgyzstan. But I think the government of Tajikistan has no interest in having in creating an enemy in Kyrgyzstan. I mean, because there's already this enemy in the south. The Taliban is already an enemy, and it's widely acknowledged in the population, within the population of Tajikistan. I think there's no really interest for Tajikistan to escalate the conflict because it doesn't have the means to just, start a war with Kyrgyzstan. There's also the pressure from the OTST, pressure from Russia. So I'm not convinced that it will fuel more, it will put just more fire or oil on the fire. But that's my personal opinion. I think there's no interest for Tajikistan in doing that.
I'll stop over there. I want to give you a chance to answer. No?
I don't think there's necessarily an ethnic dimension as to why Karim Masimov might be the scapegoat for whatever was happening between the elites in January 2022 in Kazakhstan. But I do think the fact, perhaps because of his position, he's always been kind of not at the center of power, but around power. And that may be because he's not connected through various kind of Kazakh networks, that makes him more vulnerable than somebody, and also it kind of separates him from Nazarbayev's family, because it does seem that Tokayev is trying to prevent the perception that he's going after Nazarbayev's family.
Okay, on your question, yes, on education, actually, there are two countries which had the most influence. I mean, especially in the 90s, it changed, right? Yeah, I'm going to explain, but especially in the 90s, which were Russia, and because there were some Russian schools, and Turkey, because Turkey had its Turkish schools, I mean, the Fethullah Gulen schools, which were closed. I mean, I think it was in the end of the 90s or the beginning of the 2000s. So these two countries lost a big part of their influence on education in Turkmenistan, but at the same time, you still have an indirect influence of these two countries on education in Turkmenistan, because, as I was saying, you have 95,000 Turkmen students who study abroad. A third of them, maybe about 30,000, are in Russia. I don't remember the figure about Turkey, but we know that there's still a good number of Turkmeni students in Turkey. Plus the other who are in other countries like Belarus. There are a lot of Turkmeni students who are studying there. So these countries can have an indirect influence on, and also, I mean, the United States, I mean, we have some students here, but these countries can have an indirect influence, but it remains, I mean, it remains very limited. On the field, I mean, the OSCE, the European Union countries, I mean, the United States are trying to do their best, but it is very difficult. I mean, they've been trying to bring students to organize some events, to organize some teaching, whatever. It's very difficult. And I was explaining that with a censorship on internet, it's even difficult for Turkmen students to access online training platform. I mean, they have VPNs, of course. They have VPNs, which, by the way, are more and more controlled. I mean, the Turkmen government has put a lot of pressure to control the VPNs this last 2 or 3 years. So even that is restricted. So.
Thank you, and that's time. So we'll break for our coffee break for the last panel. Thanks for all.
Thank you.